Ah, I got the thumbs up. How exciting is that? It's always nice when you can get a thumbs up before you've done anything, right? Good morning, class. So good to be here with you in the first Sunday of 2024. Yeah, I still have to think carefully before I say the year. You know what I mean? Like, I'm about to say 2024. Was that last year or is that this year? Just by way of getting myself back in because we haven't done this in almost a month, so I got to get myself back in the swing of it, and maybe y'all need that too. So let's start off gently. How was your holiday? How was your late December? Okay, a lot of non-committal answers. Larry had a good one. That's good. How was yours? Do you have a good December? Oh, yeah. Oh, see, that's the sort of feedback I'm looking for. Oh, yeah. Too many funerals is true. In fact, I just did one yesterday. Yeah. Yeah. My life schedule is all disrupted. I'm out of all the rhythms and habits, and so this week we get it all back, which I say almost every week. So we are going to continue our study today in the book of Ecclesiastes. Last time we met, we read Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And I did I sing? I don't think I sang. No. Turn. Didn't sing? Okay, that's fair. I'm not going to do it this week either. But if you stick around for service, I may or may not sing. And whether you want me to or not, that'll be a big surprise for you. Last session, we talked about a time for everything, a time to tear down, a time to build up, scatter, gather together, a time to preserve life, a time to let things die, a time to kill, a time to heal, all that kind of stuff. Which I think has a lot to do with the idea of accepting that life goes through seasons and cycles, right? It's not spring all the time, and it's not supposed to be spring all the time. We talked about, and I don't know how much we dove into this. I don't think we did much, but I think a big part of that is the freedom and peace that comes with just submitting to God's rhythms. You're not a salmon, right? Like, you're not supposed to swim upstream. We're supposed to go through the seasons of life and just appreciate each one as we're in it. We talked about the difficulty and hardship of work on earth. Oh, we also talked about probably my favorite verse in the whole book, in the whole book of Ecclesiastes, which is God has put eternity in man's heart, and yet he cannot discover what God has done from beginning to the end. And this idea that we all long for eternity, we all long for transcendence. Everybody does. Even materialist, atheist people, they still do. Talk to let's just take a staunch, anti-spiritual, completely, all that exists is the material world sort of scientist, and just get them talking about the universe and how expansive and huge it is, and you'll see it. There is that longing and that wonder and all that stuff baked in. It's just part of who we are as humans. And I spoke about this a little bit, not that specifically, but I spoke about this a little bit at Alpha's funeral yesterday, where I was saying that God made us for forever. That's just baked into who we are. And so the frailty and the mortality of life is a bit confusing to us, and it takes some work to process grief, and it takes some work to come to grips with that stuff, because that's not what we're made for. We're made for forever, which is the promise that God gives. Talked about the difficulty of human endeavor and labor on earth, and how at the end, no matter whether you work hard or don't, whether you're wise or foolish, in the end, you all end up in the same place. To which Solomon posed the question, so is it better to just be a fool and live in blissful ignorance? Or is it better to be wise and undertake the suffering that comes along with wisdom if both the wise man and the fool end up in the same place? And if I remember correctly, we spent a little bit of time wrestling in that. Is it better to be wise or foolish? Is it better to be ignorant or to carry the burdens of knowledge? And for Solomon, it seems like his answer is it's probably better to know. But it's not a complete answer. One of the big themes of the book, and one of the important things in interpreting the book, I think, is understanding that whenever Solomon is contemplating foolishness or vanity, he's doing so from the perspective of the person who can't see past the horizon of earth, right? There is no new thing under the sun. I have seen the hardship that's laid on man for all of his toils under the sun, right? So the proper perspective of God's people is not to look at everything under the sun as the whole picture, right? Is there anything that's not under the sun? S-U-N, by the way, not S-O-N, in case you think I'm being clever here. God. Yeah. And there's a distinction here, and it's made in this book, and you'll see it in the words we're going to read here in a little bit, but we see it throughout the rest of Scripture too. It's like everything that man does is temporary, but everything that God does is eternal. And so, and y'all know this is sort of like faith 101, but if you pour all of your heart and all of your hopes into what is earthly, then you have to kiss it all goodbye at some point. But if instead you set your heart on what is above, then you don't lose it. And even though maybe that entails some more hardship today, it's a pretty good investment overall, right? That's why Jesus will say, don't store up your treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal. Instead, store up treasures where? In heaven, which is under the sun? No. Where moths and rust do not destroy and thieves do not break and steal. For where your treasure is, there, you know it. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I'm sure I've preached on this before, but I'm going to just reiterate this for you because I think it's an important distinction before we move into Ecclesiastes 4. I don't think Solomon's quite reached that level of sophistication that Jesus brings later on, but they're sort of pointed at the same thing. And here's what Jesus is saying. He isn't saying, your treasures will be led by your heart. He's not saying that. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be. So, and you'll have found this in your own life if you think it through for a little bit. The advice Jesus is giving you here is if you know where you want your heart to be, then make the decision to put your treasure there. Because your heart will follow where your treasure goes. That makes sense? Like if you just take a snapshot right now, where's my treasure? That might give you a glimpse into where your heart is now, but that's not the final word on it. If you don't like where your heart is at, maybe move your treasure where you'd like your heart to be, because your heart will follow.
I've got a question about that.
Yeah.
Is it the treasure or is it the pursuit of the treasure?
Yeah, so, well, I can say Jesus isn't saying the pursuit, right? Because you might be, in your mind, you might be thinking about where in Scripture it says, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, or something like that. And treasure and money aren't necessarily equivalent either. Like, money might be a subset of that. I know for a lot of people, I'll give you a little snapshot from my time in Virginia. If we wanted to raise money for something, if we held a special event for people to come out and then, earn money that way, sell tickets to something or whatever, we would have a fairly low participation. If we asked people at the door to just drop money in a plate on the way out, we'd get way more money, even though they weren't getting anything special for it. And the reason it seems to us was that for many people, at least there, and I think it's true for people kind of all over America really, is that time is more valuable than money for most people. So that might be a treasure that you might want to consider. Energy, emotional capital, your kids, all that kind of stuff. So when we say treasure, I think often we go straight to the material, and that's true. I don't want to eliminate that from our thought process, but I think Jesus is saying, invest, and use that word as broadly as you can. Invest in where you want your heart to be, and your heart is more likely to follow than if you wait for your heart to get right before you start investing your time and energy and money and all that stuff. So that's a little bit afield from where we are in Ecclesiastes, but not too far, right? Because we found a distinction as we were reading through the first 3 chapters between the man who is happy and sleeps well at night and the man who tosses and turns and is not happy. And the difference is not in how hard they work. If you think back, I guess I can go back and read to you a little bit. This was from chapter... I guess from chapter 3 probably is the place to go. I perceive that this is chapter 3, verse 12. I perceive that there's nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do so to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat, drink, and take pleasure in it in all his toils. This is God's gift to man. And that's not the only place he says it, but that's a good spot to just point at. The idea here being, you might have 2 men that toil, one whose perspective is all that I have earned through my own grind and sweat. And another man who works equally hard, but who looks at all that he received and says, God has surely blessed me. And one of those men is going to be satisfied and is going to sleep well at night. And the other one will never be satisfied. And we'll get into that more of that today. So let's go ahead and jump in. So Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Again, I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of the oppressors, and they have no comforter. And I declared that the dead who already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is the one who has never been born, who has not seen the evil that is done, where? Under the sun. Okay, so I think as we read through this book, we see Solomon vacillating between the depression and hopelessness that he's been feeling because he's been living as a man at the pinnacle of everything under the sun. And his eyes have drifted from God. And so I think we see in this book this switch between this is me and this is what I see when I have my worldly perspective. And then he flips sometimes and says, but then when I lift my eyes to heaven, I see something else. So right now we're in that cycle of here's me seeing things from a worldly perspective. What's the big evil that he's complaining about right here? Oppression. Remind me again who Solomon is?
King.
He's the king.
There is no oppressor for Solomon.
Right. He's the king, and not only is he the king, as a nation, they're in a very strong political point, right? They're getting homage from the other nations. Everybody wants a treaty with them. Everybody wants to ally with them. What a weird thing for him to complain about, the oppression. Well, then who would the oppressor be?
Everything under the sun.
Maybe. Maybe. It might be that. People underneath him who are oppressing the people underneath them. That totally could be, right? You can imagine, let's just put this in our own context. You can imagine hypothetically, if you engage your imagination, you could imagine a good and moral president, but still with a bureaucracy under them that is corrupt and immoral, all right? So maybe we see the frustration of Solomon that he would like to do. But, as a king, you have a lot more authority than a president. There's not the same sort of checks and balances on the king of Israel.
Reminds me of when I was back in the corporate world, the executives were always frustrated that they would do these customer satisfaction or employee surveys. And, they were always frustrated that the surveys always came back negative, that the employees were dissatisfied, yet the things that they were complaining about were exactly the things that they had been trying to influence for some time. And their theory was that, well, it's the middle management. There's an oppression happening at the middle management level. And in spite of all the training and demotions and sending these guys off to supervisor training, the scores never got any better.
Yeah.
They were very frustrated.
Was there any solution?
No. Still happening.
Fascinating. So we definitely see that there's a sort of a disparity and inequity, right? Not everybody's getting fair treatment. People are being oppressed. And maybe, well, let's go on to the next bit, because this is a pretty grim outlook he's got here. He's like, yeah, I guess maybe the people who died have it better than the people alive today. And better than both is somebody who's never been born. This does not sound like a person who is optimistic. Now, let's catch a couple of things being said here. When you hear the man say, it's better the people who have already died. That's kind of a negative way of saying something that we hear said often enough. Maybe we don't recognize how negative it is when you say it in the positive.
Better place.
Not that. I mean that, but that's actually true. But what I mean is the people, when we pine for the good old days, that today is significantly worse than yesteryear. Is it? Is today worse than the 80s or the 60s or 50s? Is today better or worse than the 1800s or the 1500s? Well, I'm just throwing it out there. What's the ideal time to have lived?
Well, I always hear people say that they have an old soul. This person has an old soul. They were born 20 years too late.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Born 20 years too late. That's just because I can't muster the energy to do fashion, and I can't stand any of this newfangled music. Seriously though, like when is the ideal time to have lived? Yeah.
I think what happened is like I know some people are saying the 40s and 50s, but there was a lot of racism, so how can you really say that?
Right.
That's racism, but maybe like people are better with communities.
Yeah. What do you think? What's the ideal time to have lived?
Rome.
Pre-internet, right? For sure. Rome?
You think a lot about Rome?
I don't think a lot about Rome. No. No, I do think about an empire quite often, but it's a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. What do you think? When is the best time to have lived?
Now. These are the good old days.
These are the good old days. Well, one day they will be, right? Yeah, I think there is a certain amount of repristination that happens in our memories. When we think back, you tend to think back nostalgically on the past. I think a lot of us don't think back fairly on the past. We remember the good times maybe more than we remember the bad times. I know there's a lot of folks, maybe the generation is slowly dying off, but I know a lot of folks who kind of wish it was the 50s again. But like Emmanuel was saying, maybe the 50s were a good time for some folks, but man, they were rough for others. People remember when church was the center of community life, and churches were, all you had to do is build it, and it'd be full. And cool. As a guy who stands in front of people to do church every week, that sounds really nice. But then the flip side of it is, how much of what was going on there was genuine worship, and how much of it was community politicking, and people who were there because, well, they just didn't want their neighbors to think badly about them. And maybe they didn't know Jesus at all, really. I don't know. I don't think you really can pick a better time or a worse time. Sometimes as Christians we'll talk about maybe the days are getting darker as we get closer to the return of Christ. Maybe that's true. But there have been some pretty dark times before, for sure. So, are the people who have already died better off than the people who are here right now? I don't think so. What about this other idea? Better than both is the one who has never been born, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun. Do you think that non-existence is better than suffering?
It depends. I see these kids in these children's hospitals, and it breaks your heart.
Mm-hmm. Do you wish that they didn't exist?
Absolutely not.
Okay. Now, this is this is a thing, and remember, we're talking about Solomon looking from a worldly perspective. This idea that non-existence is better than suffering pervades secular cultures throughout the world. This is the idea behind euthanasia movements. This is the justification for countless numbers of abortions, right? Will it be irresponsible for me to let this child be born? So you believe non-existence is better than suffering?
There's a prevalent attitude now is I'm not going to have kids. I won't bring kids into this world.
Yes. Yeah. Or, and there's even sort of an anti-human spirit broadly around the world that says, humans are the problem and we probably should be a lot fewer in number. I think that Solomon, when he's looking from the worldly perspective, shares a lot of those attitudes. But is it right? Is this the proper perspective? From somebody who only looks at what's under the sun, it's understandable, right? But push come to shove, if you have life, man, that's a gift from God. even if it's hard. All right, that's only 3 verses, so let's keep moving. But I want to put this stuff out to you so you can wrestle with it. And I also want to use this as a sort of a teaching moment for you, just in how you use Scripture. Just because the words are in the Bible doesn't mean that that's God's perspective. Right? So like if you read Herod say, let's go kill all the children under 2 years old, it's not like because that's written in the Bible, let's go do that. It's like, no, you need to be able to discern, right? And this is one of those areas. Somebody could just say, well, it says in Ecclesiastes chapter 4 that it's better to not exist. Well, no, that's not how you read this thing. We're reading from a man who's struggling. Verse 4, and I saw that all toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Fools fold their hands and ruin themselves. Better one handful with tranquility than 2 handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. All right. What is this? Verse 4, all achievement, all toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another.
Keeping up with the Joneses.
Keeping up with the Joneses. And there's a term that gets used these days. Have y'all heard of FOMO? Are y'all familiar with FOMO? It's an acronym. It stands for fear of missing out. And it's powerful. It's powerful. Advertising is kind of built on this idea. Amazon, YouTube, like, it's rife with FOMO. And I'm sure you have, and I probably have, I definitely have, made purchases that aren't really worth it, right? Because everybody's saying that it's the bee's knees, and I don't want to miss out. Or maybe you start watching a show, or you go see a movie, right? Because everybody says how great it is, and maybe you didn't care about it before, but now you got to go, right? But this idea of FOMO, it's really powerful, and Solomon's taking this a step farther. He's saying, the thing that drives, if you look at all of the great achievers in the world, what drove them is envy. We did a study of Daniel not that long ago, and Nebuchadnezzar was a big deal in that book, right? You think about all the stuff that Nebuchadnezzar did, it was all about being the greatest. He wanted to be greater than everybody else who ever was. And when it seemed like God was saying he was, he felt pretty good about that too, right? This drives a lot of things in life. I mean, it can drive certainly athletic achievement, right? You just got to be on that grind because you've got to be better than everybody else. I guess I'll share this. So I have a master's. I don't have a PhD yet. And I've thought about getting a PhD a few times. It's a lot of work and a lot of time. And the reason I haven't yet is because the best reason I could think of is I know some people with a PhD, and I'm pretty sure I'm smarter than them. But that's not a good motivation, right? That's this thing, this envy thing. And so far I've not pursued it yet. And if I can find a good justification to do it, then maybe I will. But until I've got something better than, well, I'm smarter than that guy and he has it, so I should have it too. Like, But what about this? So that's on the one hand, right? So he's saying, people are just killing themselves for nothing, and that's meaningless. But then verse 5, fools fold their hands and ruin themselves. What does that mean?
They don't do anything.
Okay, so verse 4, you've got somebody who's grabbing with both hands and trying to grab as much as they can. And that's a waste. But then the fool, He throws his hands up in the air and folds his hands and says, well, I guess I won't bother. Well, is that the right answer either? Just say, nah, it doesn't matter, why bother? Is that the right answer? A fool folds his hands and ruins himself.
You hear a lot of that today. They have a term for it called quiet quitting, and people just check it out.
Yeah. So verse 6 is the key to this. He says, better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. And I don't know if this is a super spiritual point exactly. I think this is still kind of a human wisdom thing. But he's saying, you know what? Maybe it's better to have enough and then be content. One handful with tranquility is better than two handfuls if you lose all your peace in the process. So people talk about a work-life balance. I think that's part of what's being done here. But again, I don't think you reach that unless you have practiced in contentment. Because if you have one handful and you could have two, but you're not satisfied with one handful, then that one handful doesn't come with tranquility. It comes with bitterness and envy and discontent, right? So it's not about having more or having less. It's about being content with what is enough. And enough is a slippery concept. Again, I saw, verse 7, again I saw something meaningless under the sun. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling, he asked, and why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This too is meaningless, a miserable business. We have not moved on to a new topic. This is the same topic, just from a different angle, right? Why is this guy working so hard? He's not content. How many mouths does he have to feed? One. Maybe two if he's married. That's it. But he's grinding and grinding and grinding. He's piling the wealth higher and higher. And every time he looks at that, what does he say? It's not enough. It's not enough. If I ask you to sort of imagine how much wealth you would need to live the good life. And don't be clever about it. Don't be like, oh, pastors, I know pastors driving at something. I know what the right answer is. No. If you honestly picture for yourself, how much wealth do you need to live the good life? A lot of us are not going to go straight to $1 billion. I think most of us, the place we go is a little more than I have right now.
One more dollar.
That's right.
And it doesn't really matter where you are in the economic scale. For most people, the answer, their honest answer, is a little more than I have. But a little more is never enough. Our lifestyles will grow to absorb a little bit more, and then comfortable seems a little farther away. And that's what's happening to this guy. It's like he's taken care of. He's more than taken care of, and he's still out there working himself to the bone and just grinding. And for what? He's not leaving a legacy to anybody. He just doesn't feel content with what he has. We aren't moving on to a new topic yet, really, but it's going to sound like we are. And interestingly, these words, so chapter 3, we read some words that often get read at funerals. What I'm about to read to you here often gets read at weddings. If you can believe that. Really? You did a reading from Ecclesiastes at your wedding? Yeah, and it's beautiful. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their labor. I'm going to pause on that real quick. Any of y'all ever done work on a car, work on a house, whatever, and you're by yourself. And then you get somebody who can help you, who is maybe not good at the job, but if you say, hey, can you go grab that wrench for me? Hey, can you grab that hammer for me? Could you just pass me a couple nails? Does that increase your efficiency by 10%? 50%? My experience is just having somebody along with me, even if they're unskilled, which compared to me is very unskilled, right? Who can just assist, at least doubles, sometimes triples my efficiency. And it doesn't seem like it would make sense, but every time you have to climb down the ladder and back up, every time you gotta go dig in the tool bag or whatever, right? All that stuff adds up. And just having one more person often makes a bigger difference than just 1 + 1. You know what I mean? Am I alone in this? Have y'all had this experience? I guess I'm alone in this. Well,
I don't know if when we used to talk about mergers and acquisitions, the analogy is 1 + 1 never equals 2. It's always something less than 2. So there is a diminishing return. You add 1, it doesn't mean you got 2, but if you add 4, there's a very accelerated diminishing return.
Yeah. Well, and I think that might be coming from the opposite perspective, right? Because if you're talking about corporations merging, you're starting from 2 multitudes and merging them into 1 multitude. Whereas I think this text is more like you have 1 person standing alone. How much is gained by a second? 2 are better than 1 because they have good return for their labor.
But 3 is not necessarily better than 2.
Well, we'll get there in a second. If either of them falls down, 1 can help the other up. Man, if you've ever, as a general rule, if you're out in the wilderness, if you're out camping, whatever, it is better to have a buddy, right? If you're walking through a sketchy neighborhood, it's better to have a buddy, right? As soon as you have 2, you are instantly way safer than with just 1. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Also, if 2 lie together, they will keep warm. But how can 1 keep warm alone? Though 1 may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. How many people does it take for somebody to have your back? Just 1. If you can imagine being encircled by enemies, as soon as you have a partner who can stand back to back with you, suddenly nobody has your back, or nobody can get to your back, right? Though 1 may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. If we're to summarize this whole section here, this whole 9 to 12, and think back and put it in context, you've got the man who alone is amassing wealth. And that's not really enhancing his life. You move on to this section. Well, yeah, the problem isn't the wealth. The problem is he's alone. Y'all are familiar, I hope, with the story of creation, right? God makes all kinds of stuff, and on the 6th day, he makes the land animals, and in particular, he makes Adam. And he gives a partner to all the other animals, just not Adam. And Adam's there in the garden. He's doing the work. By the way, interestingly, only Adam was made in God's image. So make of that what you will at this point. And so Adam's in the garden, and he's looking at all the pair of 2 turtle doves, I guess, and a pair of tigers, and a pair of rhinos, and a pair of squirrels, whatever. Right? Oh, man. this is great, but I'm all alone. God looks at man and he says, it is not good for man to be alone. And so he makes a partner for him. Eve, his wife. And, God could have just made them both at the same time. No problem, right? And that's the way it's kind of talked about. It says male and female, he created them in his image. But we get that little picture that God gave Adam just a little bit of time by himself. I think to be able to appreciate the difference of being alone and having the partner that God gave him. Obviously, this applies in the marriage context, but it does apply in greater context too. I'm going to just say it from a church perspective right now. It is hard to be a Christian by yourself. It is hard to follow Jesus by yourself. And you're not supposed to. God made church. He told us to come together, to encourage each other, to spur each other on, to bear each other's burdens, to be a church. I get, people who are like, I get the idea, well, I don't need religion. I got Jesus, I love him. He saved me. That's all I need. Yeah, I think you overestimate yourself. And I don't think that's what Jesus is calling you to. Over and over in Scripture, we get told to not stop meeting together. When Jesus sent out his disciples, he sent them out in pairs. He never sent out a disciple by himself. Paul, in all his journeys, doesn't go by himself. He always has at least one buddy, if not a full-on entourage. And, so if you're trying to do the Christian life by yourself, man, you are making it unnecessarily hard on yourself. And if you stumble, who's going to lift you up? I think some people, they stay away from church because they don't want people to see them stumble, They're like, I don't really have my stuff together. Well, no, that church is supposed to be a place where we pick each other up when we stumble. This isn't a stumble-free zone. This is a pick each other up zone. I'm almost out of time, but I think we can get to the end of the chapter. Let's go ahead and do it. Better a poor and wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer knows how to heed a warning. Do you think that's a hypothetical statement? I think what you have there is Solomon reflecting on his life. He was probably at the height of his wisdom when he was asking God for wisdom. Better a poor but wise youth than an old foolish king who no longer knows how to heed a warning. The youth may have come from prison to the kingship, or he may have been born in poverty within his kingdom. I saw all who lived and walked under the sun followed the youth, the king's successor. There was no end to all the people who were before them. But those who came later were not pleased with the successor. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I know we see this in the world all the time. Men and women who rise to prominence with pure hearts and strong ideals. But over time, the life of fame or even of power, responsibility, it often corrupts. We can rag on politicians pretty easily. And surely some people get into politics already corrupt. But I think a lot of folks get in with the best of intentions and ideals, and they want to help people. But over time, just swimming in the waters of, well, this is how we get stuff done around here, the integrity wears away and the ideals fade. And the person at the end of their career may be a wholly different person than at the beginning. And this is, I think, Solomon, reflecting on his own life. Certainly, he began as very faithful, very, very dedicated to God alone, and by the end, he's building idols for his wives, and his family is a shambles. How did this happen? Well, somewhere along the way, I forgot how to be corrected. Somewhere along the way, I thought I had it. I was better off when I had very little, except dependence on God. And so, how do you implement something like this? I don't know that there's an easy answer to that, other than just a daily reminder to check and say, who's really king here? Am I king or is God king? What's my goal today? Is it growing my wealth for the sake of my wealth? Is it making people like me because I want to be liked? Is it serving God? Am I still humble? Am I still open to correction? I guess we'll wrap up for there today. We got to the end of the whole chapter. How about that? So next week we will most likely be looking at chapter 5.